To the extent that we live our lives in a manner that is consistent with the truth in our heart, we thrive.
Welcome to the Meier Clinics podcast, and you just heard a quote from one of your hosts, Dr. Lisa Day. Join our licensed clinical professionals from various backgrounds as they discuss fascinating mental health topics with a wide range of guests. Meier Clinics is a Christian counseling organization with multiple clinics nationwide dedicated to treating the whole person, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. Welcome to our listening family. We thank you for joining us. Hi, everyone. I'm here with Dr. Lisa Day. Hello, Lisa.
Hi, Kristin.
And dun, 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 we're going to talk about shame.
On you. Right?
Right. Shame on you for introducing it that way, Kristin. Right. Wow. What a topic, though. We need 17 weeks to just devote to this particular topic. But Lisa, please share with our listeners where you want to start with this big one.
You betcha. You know, one of my favorite writers, authors, speakers, if you will, on the concept of shame is John Bradshaw. And he wrote a book called Healing the Shame That Binds. And not that I need to go into his book, but there's a quote that he has in his book that I think is profound, and it extends beyond shame, but it certainly encompasses all of shame. And the quote goes like this: "Hell, in my opinion, is never finding your true self and never living your own life or knowing who you are." And for me, that just encompasses the prison with which hell binds us. You know, if undealt with, unrecognized, unhealed, we never live from a true, authentic self. And obviously that's going to interfere with happiness, authenticity, joy, connection, attachment, and all the other beautiful things. So I think it starts there for anybody who struggles with shame, to begin to look at how to identify it, you know, where it comes from, and some thoughts and ideas of how to begin to move out of it.
Absolutely. There's another one. And I remember reading someone's writing, I think it was Leo Basaglia, if I'm saying his name correctly, who wrote about toxic shame. And listeners, the reason I bring this up is because, you know, there are many of us who do a lot of work. I mean, just the fact that we breathe and wake up every day is us doing our work. But there are people that, you know, go to therapy and have been in different kinds of therapy and have had different, you know, workshops and so on, and they're on a life quest of learning, and you still are only going to uncover what you can handle at any given moment in time in your life. So even with me having been in therapy from 12 years old and on and off throughout my life, I still, at the age of 30, I think 37, was reading something that someone sent me about toxic shame. And as I was reading, and I went, oh, this is me. How can this be me? I've done all my work. And it was such a great humbling awakening for me to realize you're going to be doing your work, Kristin, for the rest of your life.
Well, absolutely, because I think that, you know, shame on a continuum, I think that it's fairly normal for most folks at some point in their time to experience shame. But boy, when you talk about toxic shame, it's pervasive, it's severe, and it's extremely painful. And for many people, it's, you know, it becomes so internalized that it monopolizes their personality. And so I believe truly that, you know, when you have shame, and certainly when you have toxic shame, it is a lifelong journey of awareness and looking at the various areas where it shows up. And just when you think you've got it nicked, you learn another area where it's just creeped right in, and you didn't even, you know, connect it to shame.
Exactly. You turn around and you go, oh, wow. Okay. Yes, I do those things still. If it hits me in a place where I immediately feel ashamed, I want to cry, not cry as in, hey, it's okay. Everybody has tears and you can have those over many different things, sometimes over the same thing over the course of your life. And that's okay. It's just, you have different levels of dealing with it. But you know what I'm talking about, listeners, when something hits you and it's that cry that comes from somewhere within you that you really keep a tight lid on, that kind of feeling of, I have more work to do here.
Well, and truly, because normal shame, it will resolve in a couple of days. If we feel the shame about having handled a situation poorly or lost our power and reacted negatively to our family member, neighbor, or what have you. But I think that the toxic shame, it resides in our unconsciousness, and it pervades every cell of our body, affects us physically, emotionally, neurochemically. It's pervasive. It's pervasive. But I think what's important too, that sometimes people mix up the concepts, of guilt and shame.
Right.
And, one of the easiest definitions that I came across years ago, at least that keeps it in perspective for me, is that guilt is that I've done something wrong. I've done something bad. Shame is that I am wrong, that I am bad. The core essence of my character is defective, unworthy, not subject to healthy connection, joy, attachment, that it's profound, it's pervasive.
And oftentimes the biggest shame throwers, so flamethrower, but replace that with shame. The biggest shame throwers are people who absolutely operate from a sense of toxic shame that is unresolved.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when we look at, the process of shame and the things that can contribute to it, but then you look at how it's presented, I think that people fall into most often, well, maybe three categories. I was going to say two, but I think there's a middle one there as well. And the ones who are angry, aggressive, and gaslighting and attacking, wanting to put you into a place where your esteem is shattered so that they can feel needed, can turn around and then feel needed by you. The aggression, the output certainly comes from shame. And then we can have the other end of the spectrum where an individual who struggles with shame is always feeling less than and find themselves moving into the victim role, and not in a manipulative fashion, but really a familiar and survival fashion, at the other end of the extreme. But then I think there's this in between, and I mean, I think it's all purgatory, no matter where you are in that spectrum of shame. But I think that one of the things that is so challenging is that many folks who have shame and struggle with shame, they carry this sense that there's nothing that one can do to purge it. There's nothing that they can do to get rid of it. And so they endure it. They carry it. They see it as a part of self.
And they can become very resentful of people who don't live with it. I remember when I was younger, I think it was age appropriate considering what I was going through. But I just couldn't be happy for other people's happiness. I was so living in so much shame and toxic shame that if I got invited to a party or a wedding or something and two people were in love and happy, I just could not even stand to be there.
Because it's so painful.
Because it was just too painful. And so in some ways I was probably miserable to be around at certain things. And don't invite Kristin because I brought not just me, but I brought this layer cake of shame with me wherever I went that, started it with inside of me and then spilled out of every pore.
Well, and there's research that shows, you look at people in this world who, particularly if you have shame or have struggled with shame in the past, and you look at those people, other people, and you think they're happy, they're joy-filled, and they have these fruitful, healthy, productive relationships. And then when you're harboring the shame, you feel paralyzed by it. And the research that I thought was just really incredibly simple, and it makes sense, but it showed that the difference between people who live fulfilling, joy-filled, happy, great relationship lives and those who struggle and have dysfunctional relationships, feelings of failure, never feeling okay within their skin, looking to numb and distracted, the main difference is feeling like you are worth it. That the feeling that I am worth it is the pivotal component to happiness versus painful struggle. And the numerous causes to shame just raid that worth. That, one of the core components, regardless of the cause of the shame, is that I'm not worthy. I don't deserve. I'm of no value.
Right. Right. And if you're, raised in an environment where your parents also carry toxic shame, you're not just dealing with generational trauma, you're not just dealing with abuse that can come from being raised in that kind of environment, you're also dealing with, you're not allowed to not feel shame because generations before you, it's one of those things where once it sticks on you, it's it's such a poisonous, draining, soul draining thing to carry around with you that you really can't, you don't have enough room to feel anything other than that shame. So your parents, even unwittingly, can put that on you as a little kid where, you come out the womb and you're like, hey, I'm a little kid, here I am. Yeah, 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 yeah. And they just immediately start, don't get too big for your britches or whatever it is that goes on. And you don't even realize that, okay, now you're being infected too.
Well, and I think that, we certainly want to talk a little bit about the most common and profound and pervasive and destructive causes of shame, that being the abusive family.
Mm-hmm.
I have a category, or it's a conglomerate of 3 different ones. And I often say, and this sounds strange, but I say it comes from families that quote unquote love too much, meaning in not having effectively dealt with their own shame dynamics, they come into child rearing as parents, and they can be over controlling and enmeshed. And the over controlling is that, I know what's best for you. You need to comply to my wishes. You need to take your piano lessons. You need to learn how to curtsy. You need to get, straight A's. And it comes from a place of quote unquote wanting the best in their child, but really oftentimes it's the parents' own unmet or unresolved, with regard to shame. And likewise, the enmeshed, people come so injured from their previous families that when they are raising their own children, there's no boundaries. I don't end and you don't begin. And there's a group think. And then we end up in both of those dynamics with what I like to refer to as borrowed shame, that we're not only carrying our own shame of not being seen in either that controlling family or in that enmeshed family, not having an identity of our own, but we're carrying the shame of our parents.
Absolutely.
But I think that the biggest one, I think the one that we all come to and we see the greatest pathology and also the greatest limitations for, and I think that many people can unfortunately relate to, is, and it's not isolated to the abusive family, but abuse in our childhood and how that imprints, for the whole concept of shame.
Yes, absolutely. It can be abuse that's happening out, outside the home. Plenty of friends of mine have had something happen with a teacher or something that happened at school or, whatever, or as an adult, something happened as they were taking, walking in a garage or whatever it is, then you embody that experience. And it's when it stays trapped there that it starts to become this poison that's dripping into you constantly, especially if you don't, have really good experiences with wonderful people that know how to deal with this immediately after whatever happened.
Well, and that exactly, people will sometimes say to me, is it possible to be exposed to any level of abuse during your developmental years and not have shame? And, Kristin, I think the answer to that is no.
Yeah.
I think that we have different levels, certainly different levels of resilience, but I think we have different levels of acknowledging that what in fact we're dealing with is shame. Because sometimes, and we have different levels of abuse, whether it's emotionally or physically, sexually, there's so many different forms of abuse. But in some folks, how that's internalized is to develop this role, this facade, and they become highly perfectionistic. They're straight A students. They're on top of the head of the student council. They excel in sports and activities. They're well known. They're well loved. People are crazy about them. And so there's nothing about what you see that would indicate any level of shame. But when you spend any time with that individual, you look at the core of the torment that they have that drives that perfectionism, that the only way to survive is to be right, on all levels. And not in a I'm right, you're wrong, but what society expects for me to be right so no one can see my pain. So it's not always evident, even to the person, that what's, the underlying fuel source in that is a source of shame.
So when you're working with someone and let's say they are that very perfectionistic, and for whatever reason they ended up saying, well, okay, even though I'm always right, I will go to therapy. How do you, unpack that with someone where you can see clearly what's going on because you're their counselor, but you know that you can't just, deliver what you see. You can only deliver the message. You'll scare people. You'll frighten them away from coming to counseling. So how do you walk that line when you're working with someone?
I think that is such a brilliant question. And before I answer that, I would say that sadly, many of these people end up that, the puzzled look of why would that person have taken their life? They had absolutely everything going for them. They were just success and all the check boxes that needed to be checked off in this thing we call life. And unfortunately, on the most pathological end of that perfectionism is someone who is not able to embrace that they need help. It's far too terrifying. But what I do find clinically is that individuals will embrace that operating system of life and their success only to find that they begin to experience debilitating depression and or panic attacks, or they might present with severe GI, gastrointestinal challenges, physical challenges. And when they come in, and they're going to present perfect, they're going to have their paperwork, perfectly filled out. They're going to sit, perfectly attentive with their legs crossed and their hands folded in their lap. And they're going to say, everything in my life is fantastic, but something's wrong. And one of the very first things I ask them is, what does this concept mean to them? I said, where does good enough come into play in your life?
Hi, this is Dr. Paul Meier of the Meier Clinics. Our Christian counselors across the country have a goal of helping all those who come to us to become what God has called them to be. If you're in a situation where you're not at peace within yourself, or you just feel like there's joy that's missing in your life, we can come alongside to help you obtain peace and joy.
This message is sponsored by the Meier Clinic Foundation, a nonprofit Christian counseling ministry. The number is 1-888-7-CLINIC, 1-888-7-CLINIC.
Where are you able to be good enough? And it really is a startled look, that deer in the headlight look at me, and that doesn't have any concept. It has no room in their operating system. Every aspect of their life they do, at high levels of excellence. But when you also ask them, what is your truth? What thrills you, fuels you? Who do you spend time with? Who are your close people? These people are very isolated. They may have one close confidant, and typically they have one, because not many people can survive that long into their 20s, 30s, 40s without one confidant. Right. But they're typically very isolated because they're terrified that if someone really saw the inside, they would see the failure, the insecurities, the badness that sometimes isn't even identified. When a child is sexually abused, particularly by a family member, that child communicates the violation of the body to the general violation of self. And if that violation comes at the hands of the very person who is supposed to protect you, the damage is so very internal and so very intense that it messes up all areas of the operating system. And they truly feel like damaged goods. Truly, something is wrong with me, that the person in this world that was intended to protect me is the very person that has violated me at my core being. And so the entire world is unsafe. And therefore, many times these people are not even truthful to themselves, with regard to who am I? It's all about the book of shoulds written by they. They say these things should be done in order to be okay.
Right. I know. And I just was talking about that with you earlier, and I've been talking about it with other podcasters about the language that is used when it comes to shame, especially as it relates to sexual abuse, but to other things as well, really has got to change. I hope that it does, because there's so many studies now about trauma and how it affects the brain, and that if it happens as when you're a child, you are just wired differently. You can look at a brain scan and see, yes, this person's brain is different from other people. So we have the science behind this too, but what we don't have yet is enough people in healing professions that change their language when they're dealing with someone who has had that kind of trauma and who lives with the shame that comes with it.
Well, and even as treatment providers, I mean, I think that was part of our discussion, that treatment providers, we need to continue to educate ourselves of how to approach. And I think that we can have, we're, as treatment providers, as therapists, we're taught to have active listening. But I definitely think there's a difference between active listening and genuine compassion. Genuine, oh my golly. I had a client many moons ago when I was back in Seattle, a very successful professional, and she had come in, and she comes from certainly a background of that very controlling family and difficulty identifying self. And so again, on the checkbooks of life, she's the house, the car, the camper, the husband, the profession, the practice. She was a surgeon, and she'd gotten a DUI, and we were probably 6 months into therapy before she said, "There's something I need to talk to you about." And it took nearly the entire session for her to be able to say, "I got a DUI last year." And the magnitude, it completely derailed her. It completely derailed every level of her functioning. And, I think too oftentimes therapists are going to say, "Well, that's okay. We can find a way to get you into the 12-step program, and there's a way to recovery, and you will be okay after you do such and so." Meaning, yeah, you are wrong. That was bad. And you know what I mean? Tap right into it.
Doctor.
Yeah. And I think that as therapists, we have to really go to the, oh my golly, that must have been terrifying for you. That must have been terrifying to be put in prison, to affect your job, to affect your community, to be publicized in the local newspaper. How are you with that? And where is that coming out today? And so, when I get someone, and, shame, as we both know, can come from so many sources, but when it's a toxic shame, a pathological shame, we want to start with compassion. We want to start by providing that safe place to share all of the uglies that a person doesn't feel like happened to them, but feel like is them.
It is so hard to become there's dust in the corners and it's okay person when you come from toxic shame or just shame in general. It's a ongoing practice. I mean, I remember just even something as well, not silly, but as my company website. If there was I watched it like a hawk. If there was any mistake with grammar or all the people that would have seen this and just all this stuff around shame. And, there were many other things too. I'm using that as an example. And now I'm like, you know what? My company's gotten so big in terms of the amount of content we have. Yeah, there's spelling errors and stuff. And yeah, that's okay. That's just, there's dust in the corners of my life. Oh, well. So to go from to, well, you don't really like it, but it's okay. It's such a leap across the Grand Canyon. And people don't really realize that that's the journey that it can take.
Well, and I was going to say, very indicative of some hard work that you've done and some active coping mechanisms that you use. Because, when we look at, how shame presents, and certainly when we look at how to embrace a healing path, it doesn't go away. We're able to recognize it. I teach assets and liabilities are being things that drain, deplete, distract, and ultimately derail. Let me tell you, shame shows up on liabilities all over the place. Mm-hmm. And I tell my clients, you want to begin to recognize it in your life in the same manner that you would recognize a Dalmatian dog, right? Oh, it's got spots. It's a Dalmatian. And it's, right. Oh, there's that feeling. It's the shame. And then being able to, launch into the appropriate coping mechanisms with it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is why, listeners, I surround myself with counselors, because they say wonderful things like, the leaps that you're making, Kristin, just don't right now about the situation really don't seem very healthy. And I'm exactly. Like, right. And because I feel so comfortable with counselors, whether they're a friend or my actual counselor, I don't go to shame about that stuff because I feel so very safe within this profession, even though I've had some not so hot experiences with some counselors, because they have people too. So it's but boy, I'm 49. I mean, if someone would have said that to me, no matter how well-meaning at 20, I would have immediately run and wanted to hide in a bathroom and, die right there.
Reinforcing the shame.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, and I think that people don't realize that, you and I speak of shame, and we know, we can see that Dalmatian, right? We know exactly what shame is, but I think that for lay people, they don't always know what it is. And, we want to be on guard, or at least on the lookout for that, with a shame-bound person, there's just a failure of self-esteem. So it's not a matter of these things challenge my self-esteem. It's that's non-existent. It's void. When the self-esteem cards were given out, somehow, I was flat on the floor.
You're right. I got in the wrong line, and I didn't get the self-esteem card line. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And as we were saying earlier, I think of someone who's, paralyzed by shame. My first thought process is going to go to that quiet, withdrawn, not comfortable speaking up or sharing their mind, certainly not the life of the party person. But we don't always think that aggressive rager, domestic violent individual, pathological narcissistic sociopath, that anger and rage, also that person is burdened and plagued with shame, which we tend to not like those people and want to put them in a compartment over there. Right. But when we can extend that same compassion, that anger is a way of protecting that horrifically injured child, that kid whose jaw was broken because he said, hey, you know what? All my friends are staying out late. I think it's time for me. And then boom, jaw was broken. And so that person just repeating that pattern, so we can see, we look at, the failures in self-esteem, and we can see both the victim or the aggressor. But I don't know many people in my practice who have unresolved shame, who could say that they've had healthy, successful, intimate relationships.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
and intimate, not just talking about sex, but intimate with regard to best friends, loving connections.
Absolutely. Doing that call to work something out, having an profoundly uncomfortable conversation through a disagreement. I mean, there are people, thank God, in my life that with a life full of exits of family and all those things that I had no control over because I was a kid, to have a friend that I've had since, for, 16 years, that's a big deal. Well, even my ex-husband, 30 years now, having people, the longevity of those relationships is huge to me, someone with all these exits and a lot of shame. And when I look at the two people that I have these long-term relationships with, there were times when we hated each other and we didn't communicate. It wasn't all la, 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 all the years that we've known each other. It just wasn't, but we had those uncomfortable, vulnerable, painful, I blew it, and I'm in shame about how I blew it. We had those conversations, and we're still in each other's lives.
Well, being able to own that, I screwed up and I need to take ownership of that isn't something that someone with shame is going to readily do, because it unleashes that wound that's not been healed. And, what we see, clinically is that folks who do have shame, they tend to organize their world as good or bad, right or wrong, in or out. And unfortunately, there's a terrorizing driving force of being the bad, the wrong, and the out. And so if they come across, in their relationships or their attempts to develop intimate relationships, if they are wronged, or if there's bad, or if they're out, they're gone. There's not that, vulnerability. There's not that space to explore. And so they look like very judgmental, unforgiving, self-righteous people, but it's a way of organizing their world to stay safe.
Right. Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yes. And I think unpacking that, this is what I love about the Catalyst program, because I love it that Meier Clinics does this, where you can come and you can do 7 days, 15 days, 30 days, and to have a crash course in you is amazing to me, and people will always say, not always, but most of the time say, I can't take that kind of time out of my life. Mm-hmm. I have a job, I have kids, I have school, I have and I always think, oh, but you can. All of those things can wait. And the person that you're going to be and the operating system that you will have, because you took a measly 30 days out of your 80-year life. It's so valuable. All those things can wait. You lose nothing and you gain everything.
Well, the free to be me, the freedom to be
Yes.
self is the movement out of that hell that we talk about with Bradshaw's, quote. And the other thing, Bradshaw's work is very popular in the 12-step, community, because cornerstone to darn near any addiction, alcoholism, drugs, opiates, cocaine, whatever, is the shame dynamic. And that's one of the powerful components. And, we could talk a little bit about how do you heal from shame, but one of the most powerful components, of the 12-step program, of the Catalyst program, of getting in with a good therapist is a place to be able to bring that shame into relationship with other people and to realize the shame is not my fault. I'm borrowing it. This is something that happened to me in my developmental years that I've internalized. And finding that place, or, sometimes I talk about with my clients of learning how to create a family of friends, because oftentimes our biological family is the source of shame, and it doesn't change. It can be 20 years and we go back into the house and it's the same role, the same feelings, the same neurochemical response to all the triggers there, in that dynamic.
Oh, yes. Listeners, I just blocked my mother on Facebook again. I unblocked her because I was like, okay, I don't need to have that. Nope. Bunch of shame stuff. Nothing's changed. Time to block again. And that's, I would say that's sad. Oh, well, there are a lot of people that have issues with their parents. Big deal. Dust in the corners. Move on.
we are powerless over all other people, places, and things. We're powerless over what happened to us, when we were growing up or in a relationship, even if the shame occurred later in life. We're powerless over going back and taking that away, but we have full control over what we expose ourselves to. And if those triggers take us back to that place, we can certainly prevent ourselves from being exposed to it. Because the healing process, as we were talking about, the healing process of shame is pervasive and profound. It takes an active awareness, really 24/7.
Oh,
you can oversleep your alarm, by 15 minutes. You're still not going to be late for work, but you've overslept and you wake up with this heart pounding panic that, oh no, I'm 15 minutes beyond waking up. And it's just 15 minutes, right? You're not going to be able to water the plants maybe, but the visceral reaction is paralyzing. It's just paralyzing.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk in the 3 minutes we have left
about some tidbits. Absolutely. Yeah. So first and foremost, we want to, as I mentioned, we want to know that shame is not our fault. We didn't bring it. We didn't pick it. We didn't sign up for it. We didn't go to the shame card line versus the self-esteem line. The next thing is we really need to face it. We need to face it. We need to experience it, and we need to incorporate that. And that means with a skilled, safe other, whether it's a therapist, a pastor, a very close, safe friend. We need to have a place to say, I feel mortified by this, or I need to explore this which happened to me, which I've been keeping in secret, because if anybody knew that I was raped when I was 12, I would be damaged goods and they wouldn't want to be my friend, my lover, my partner, what have you. We need to face that shame. We need to experience it. We need to incorporate it. I say that the definition of grief that I find to be the most effective is the integration of profound sadness. And with shame, we try to separate from the profound sadness and I believe that it's a pervasive pattern that it's a part of who we are. I have two hands, I have shame, and that's just not the case. It's just not the case. We want to learn that, that we want to really be clear on that distinction, in the coping mechanisms of differentiating guilt from shame, that we all mess up. We all do things. We can lose our control and tell someone to, go jump in a lake or something more profound.
Right. And then be like, wow, that was not a best moment for me.
Yeah, we can lose control and say things like, I'm selling your car, I'm kicking you out, and your bags are on the front. We say these things. We're human beings, and we need to wrap our arms around ourselves and embrace that we should feel guilty about that, and we should seek constructive repair.
Yes.
But being able to cognitively differentiate guilt because I've done something wrong from shame that makes me wrong is imperative. And then truly, as I just mentioned, I think that the lifelong pursuit, and Kristin, I think that you live, eat, breathe, and practice this, is making new parents, right?
Yeah,
and our
totally.
And our
including
parents
your
don't-
own, your
Exactly.
own, you're the parents within you that are always parenting those younger versions of you. That's primary importance, as well as having other people in your life that are your friends.
Well, and
good
our parents
parental role
don't
model.
need to be 25 years older than us. We can have a
No.
close girlfriend who really does give us maternal love, support, and encouragement.
Absolutely.
And we can have a male friend who's 10 years younger than us that gives us that parental
dad
protection and
stuff.
direction. Yeah. Yeah. And so, I don't mean to present that it's that easy, but I say that, that healing is based in the simplicities, but that we are the ones who make it complex, and not simple that we can cross our arms and do I blink of genie. I'm dating myself on that example, but that it's facing it and moving toward it. Much like if we're being chased by a dog when we're running down the street, it's going to bite us in the derriere. We want to turn and face it and stand strong and look at it and see it as a danger and look at how we can cope with it so that we're not on an ongoing risk of being bit by it.
Right.
So-
Right. And don't ever forget too, listeners, that sometimes there are a lot of people out there that want to offload their shame, and they're experts at it, and they aren't really offloading their shame because it always comes back to them. I mean, they're in a perpetual state of motion, meaning running away from their shame, but they can be, the velocity at which they try to offload their shame onto you can be quite astounding. And if you're a big, giant empath, you can feel like you're just this giant waste receptacle of other people's toxic shame.
Well, and on that, I'll chime in super quick. That is, we are an empath and we are involved with a narcissist and they gaslight us into feeling that shame. We have to be super careful because it can infect us at the level that we begin to act like that narcissist.
Oh,
Aggressively, angrily. Absolutely. And so if we feel like we want to knock someone's head off and we feel like they're, a piece of dirt, that's a pretty good indication that we are being infiltrated or infected by someone else's shame.
Exactly. So remember that tool that we've talked about. Whatever doesn't belong, anytime something just doesn't feel like you, but boy, you're feeling something, you can just stop right there and say, whatever doesn't belong to me, whatever isn't mine, leave now. Take a deep breath and say it a couple times if you have to, and just keep practicing that, because I guarantee you'll build up that muscle, and then you'll be able to just snap your fingers, even if you get caught with carrying someone else's stuff, and go, okay, and reset yourself. It doesn't have to become an infection. It can just become an awareness, and then got to let go of that.
I like that.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lisa Day. This was a great discussion on shame, one of many.
It doesn't go away.
That's right. Exactly. We will continue to have a discussion about this, but thank you for joining me, Lisa, as usual.
Thank you so much, Kristin.
And thank you, listeners, for tuning in to another episode of the Meier Clinics podcast. We hope you enjoyed this podcast. Tune in next time for another engaging discussion on relevant mental health topics. If you have any questions about Meier Clinics, please visit our website at meierclinics.com. That's MEIER clinics.com, or call us at 888-7-CLINIC. Don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or any of your favorite podcast apps. And please note that we are a member of and produced by Mental Health News Radio Network, MHNRnetwork.com.